And we are continuing with the 8th chapter of Dragons in the Water by Madeleine L'Engle, which is called Murder. We're picking up from the pause in the pages, but it's a direct response to the last video where it says, "I doubt lunch will be a pleasant meal," and it begins by saying it was not. In the dining room, the fans whirred heavily through the silence. The passengers picked at their food. The meal was over early, and nobody lingered in the salon for coffee. After lunch, the children did not know what to do. They could not go to the dragon's lair, past the hearse with its terrible passenger, even had the captain not put the lower deck out of bounds. The adults, instead of repairing to their cabins for a siesta, went on to the aft deck, seeking the breeze, too uneasy to rest. Dr. Wordsworth and Dr. Eisenstein went up to the boat deck and grimly began their pacing, up, down, around, up, down, around. Polly went off to talk to Geraldo. Charles followed his father around. Boone took Simon into his office and showed him a tattered book of pictures of Venezuela. Simon leafed through it politely, pausing to study a large color photograph taken from a plane of Dragon Lake, with the Quistano huts high on their stilts, far out into the lake. There was a knock on the doorframe, and Mr. Theo looked in. "Come and amuse me, young Simon." Boone nodded. "I have work to do. I must lock my office." He spoke heavily. "We are locking everything as though we were in port." Mr. Theo took Simon out onto the deck. "It is hard-hearted of me," he said, "but my main concern is that I get to Caracas in time for Emily's concert." "I guess I feel pretty hard-hearted too," Simon said. "I didn't want him to die or anything, but he did make me feel very uncomfortable, and I didn't want him taking the portrait away from Aunt Leonis and me. And I felt that he was glad to be getting me away from Polly and Charles, and that he didn't want me ever to see them again. And he frightened me." Mr. Theo asked quickly. "How?" Simon shook his head slowly. He could not say that it was because Dr. Wordsworth had made him realize that Cousin Forsyth was somebody very different from the elderly bachelor, overly tidy, impeccably courteous, that he had appeared to be during the month in South Carolina. So he said, "He was always quiet and polite, but there was something underneath." "What?" "Polly and Charles think he didn't like me, and I think they're right." The wind blew through Mr. Theo's hair, ruffling it leonily. "Let us be grateful for this breeze. We may not have it after we dock. Have you noticed how quiet the ship has become? No more music." "I guess they don't feel like singing." "The sound of guitar and flute was part of the breathing of the ship. I feel an emptiness." "Me too." "Come on, then. Let us gird up our loins. The captain suggests that I bring you to the bridge. There'll be fishing boats for you to see on his radar machine." It seemed to Simon that the captain was careful to see that he was always with an adult, never left alone. It was this which made him accept the unpleasant fact that somebody had already tried to take his life. That this somebody might be interested in disposing of him, as of Cousin Forsyth. But why? Why? None of it made sense. He began counting the hours until Aunt Leonis would arrive. It was no more than 24 hours now, or hardly more, only a day. But would a frail old woman be able to protect him? Was she, too, coming into danger? At bedtime, Simon felt strange in the O'Keefe cabin, no matter how easy he was with Charles. But Charles was in one of his silences. He seemed to be completely withdrawn from Simon. His face was cold and forbidding. It was not until the lights were turned off earlier than usual that Charles spoke. "Simon, I have to talk to you," he paused. "I'm listening," Simon said after a while. "What I have to tell you doesn't seem to have much to do with Cousin Forsyth and the portrait, but it does have to do with you." And in a cold, completely emotionless voice, he told Simon all he had learned from Jan. "Of course, it's all muddled," he concluded. "It's an old story, and stories tend to get exaggerated and changed. But too much of it fits in with my dreams, and Jan said the Englishman is called the Fair. Jan said he's always thought it was spelled Fair, but it's too close to fair for comfort, isn't it?" "Nothing's comfortable," Simon said. "And it does have to do with the portrait, since Umar is written on the back." "Yes, I suppose it does. It's just Cousin Forsyth who doesn't seem to fit in." "Simon, I'm sorry." "It would be more of a shock," Simon said in a small, chill voice, if Polly and Geraldo hadn't suggested it to me already. I tried to put it away as speculation and dream and not reality. But so much has happened. I don't seem to know which is which anymore. Charles said softly into the darkness. It doesn't mean Quentin wasn't. I know how much he means to you, how you admire. The cabin fan whirred softly and steadily. It means he wasn't the kind of person I thought he was. And that changes me too. The breeze lifted and blew gently through the open windows. Then Simon asked, do you think somebody killed Cousin Forsyth in order to get to the portrait? Maybe, but who? And where did the portrait vanish to? The only person who, Simon paused, said, Jan. If Jan were going to steal the portrait and kill Cousin Forsyth, he'd hardly have told me all he did, but either he or Mr. Boone is lying about the key. All this wanting to be revenged on the fair, I don't really understand. I do, Charles said quietly. You may remember that Polly told you that 2 years ago a friend of ours was murdered in Lisbon, and Polly and I wanted him avenged. All right. There were several people we hated ferociously, and then we ended up with Daddy having to help the person who was most responsible for his death. So I understand. I just don't understand it's going on and on this way. No. Uncle Father, it's important for him to know all this. I suppose so. Maybe Quentin had a reason for not coming back, Simon. Ninny Ann, Simon said bitterly. But you love Ninny Ann, and Aunt Leonis talks to her. I'm very confused, Simon said. Quentin broke his word. Words sometimes do get broken, Simon. Not Quentin Fairs. I know a lot of politicians nowadays, and even presidents, don't take promises seriously, and even lie under oath. But I was brought up to speak the truth. My father's newspaper was sometimes in trouble because he uncovered truths and cared about honor. And Quentin Fair was always our idea of a man of perfect honor, who cared for the truth above all things, and who spent his youth helping to free an oppressed continent. Well, he did do that, Charles pointed out. He spent his youth with Bolivar. Simon was silent. After a while, Charles suggested, Why don't you cry? I'm too old. Mother says it's silly for men to feel they shouldn't cry at appropriate times. Have you ever seen your father cry? At appropriate times. Do you consider this an appropriate time? It's a death. I don't feel like crying about Cousin Forsyth. Quentin, the man you wanted to be like, is dead. He never was. As Polly said, he was too good to be true. So maybe if you cry about him, then you'll be ready to find the real Quentin Fair. I'm not sure I want to, Charles pointed out. He brought us all into quite an adventure. You'll have to say that much for him. And that is the end of chapter 8.